Hello everyone, I'm going to talk about some examples in this video. With the first one, what components of GDP, if any, would each of the following transactions affect, and explain. Let's write the components of GDP. As you know, GDP is composed of consumption, the spending that the families do on consumption goods, plus investment. The firms are buying investment goods like computers, equipment that they will use for further production. Here the investment, when we say investment in economic terms, it's not the same as finance term. It's not the stocks and bonds. These are the physical goods that the companies buy for further production. Plus government spending. When we say government spending, it is the spending that government is making, for example, for military, for building roads, for national parks. Plus net exports. Net exports is composed of export minus imports. And I'm assuming that you know the definition of export and import. So here a family buys a new refrigerator. As you know, a refrigerator is a consumption good. So the consumption expenditure will increase, so the GDP. Okay? So this is a very simple example. When you buy something new, as you see, that's for consumption. Consumption part of GDP will increase. As you know, since this is an accounting identity, if you increase the right-hand side of the equation, you need to increase the left-hand side too, or vice versa. The second example, Aunt Jane buys a new house. So the house example is kind of tricky here because we assume that houses are investment, okay? They are not consumption goods. So the only difference is the buying a house. Buying a house is not considered as consumption. Here, if we write all components of GDP, investment is going to increase. Since investment is increasing on this side, the GDP increases on the other side. Okay. Next example, Ford sells a Mustang from inventory. So let's look at the GDP again. It's composed of consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net exports. When Ford sells a Mustang from inventory, as you know, when you produce a car and if you cannot sell the car at that year you produce, you put the car in the inventory, and that inventory is considered as investment. So when you sell a Mustang from inventory, investment decreases by one car. And at the same time, consumption increases by one car because you buy a car, consumption increases by one, investment decreases by one. So the net effect on GDP is zero. GDP doesn't change in this example. So why did this happen? Is because of the definition of GDP. As you know, the GDP is the market value of all goods and services produced in a year. But as I said, it's in a year. So the goods should be produced in that year. If you produce something like a car in, let's say, 2005 and put it in the inventory, and you sell that car in 2006, this car is not considered a new item, and you cannot count this in 2006 GDP because it's belonging to 2005 GDP. And when a company cannot sell the car, when the company puts in the inventory in 2005 GDP, you include that car as an investment, okay? But in 2006 here, like in this example, when you sell the car from the inventory, the investment decreases by 1 unit because you take it from your inventory, but at the same time, consumption increases by 1 unit, the value of the car, and the GDP is not affected. Third example, you buy a pizza. As you know, GDP composed of consumption, investment, government, and net exports. Since consumption increases by 1 unit pizza, GDP increases by 1 unit. The fourth example, California repaves Highway 101. So here, this example is different than the others because, as you see here, this is a government expenditure. So the government expenditure will increase as well as the GDP. And the fifth example, your parents buy a bottle of French wine. Let's write the GDP again. consumption plus investment plus government plus. Now I'm going to open the net exports. Exports minus imports. As you know, when you buy a French wine, it's a consumption good, so your consumption will increase. But I know that because of the GDP definition, GDP is the goods, the market value of all goods and services produced domestically. So I know that French wine is an import, so since you buy a French wine, imports will increase by 1 unit and consumption will increase by 1 unit. Since there's a minus sign in front of imports, they will cancel each other and there's not going to be any change on GDP. So this is again an accounting identity. When you buy French wine, yes, true, your consumption will increase as much as the value of the French wine, but at the same time, there is one component in GDP which is the import. Imports are also increasing by 1 unit, and you are subtracting imports from the GDP calculation. That's why GDP is not going to be affected. And this example, Honda expands its factory in Marysville, Ohio. So here, let's write the GDP again. Consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. And I know that Honda expands its factory is an investment. Okay, when you build a factory, all these spendings are considered as investment. When investment increases, GDP increases. Next example, you buy a used car. So GDP is consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. So when you buy a used car, you cannot count in any of these categories in GDP. It's not a consumption good because it's a used car. GDP never count the used cars and used products. Everything that you calculated in GDP is produced within a period of time, and maybe a year, maybe a quarter. Okay? So this is not going to affect any components of GDP. Next one. Ford produced 100 new cars and cannot sell any of the cars. So this is the example of how the inventories are changing and how the inventory change affect the GDP accounting. Here, as you see, 100 new cars should be included in the GDP, but how we are going to include, because Ford cannot sell this 100 new cars, Ford is going to put these cars in the inventory, and inventory, the change in inventory will be reflected in investment. It will increase the investment by 100 cars and the value of the 100 cars, and the GDP will increase by the value of this 100 cars. So let's look at this question. This is a kind of calculation. The country of Pantherville produces two goods, footballs and basketballs. Below is a table showing prices and quantities of output for 3 years. The first part of the question is asking calculate nominal GDP for each year. As you know, the nominal GDP is easy to calculate because you are going to multiply the price times quantity to find the nominal GDP. Here, the price of football is $10 times 120 footballs. But this is not the only good produced in the country, so there is another good basketball, 12 times 200. So as you see here, 1200 plus 2400, you get $36,000 of GDP. This country has in year 1 $36,000 of GDP. Let's look at the year 2. Year 2 we will do the same calculation. Let's do that same calculation. Okay. Year 2. Now the price of footballs are 12 times 200. Let's write the GDP, nominal GDP here. Plus 15 times 300. And we will get 24 plus 45, which will is going to be 6,900 here. The GDP is 6,900, which is nominal GDP in year 2. And now let's calculate year 3. Year 3. The price of football is 14 times 180 plus 18 times 275. So we can use our calculator to calculate. So you can do by yourself too. So it's 14 times 180 will give us 2,520 plus 18 times 275 is 4,950. So the two together will be 7,470. Okay, these are the GDPs, nominal GDPs. Next part of the question says that using year 1 as the base year, calculate real GDP for each year. So why base year is important? Base year is important because we will use the base year prices to calculate the GDP in each year. So that means the prices are going to be constant. Since base year is 1, the price of the football is not going to change through the years. It's not going to be 12 in second year. I'm going to use the first year's price, which is 10. On the third year, I'm going to use $10 instead of $14 to calculate the value of the football. So let's calculate year 1 real GDP. 10 times 120 plus 12 times 200. If you do this calculation, you'll realize that you will find the same as the nominal GDP. So the real GDP in year 1, 3,600. Why we get the same result? Because the real GDP is using the same prices as the nominal GDP. That's why in the base year, you have the same results. Let's calculate the second year. For second year, we expect it's not going to be the same because the quantities are changing and I'm using the constant prices, which is the year 1 prices. Let's erase this one too. Now we are calculating the year 2's real GDP. So the price of football is going to stay the same times 200 the quantities of the football plus 15 times, I'm sorry, not the 15, you shouldn't make this mistake as I do, because now we are using the base year prices, 12 times 300. So as you see, the prices are constant but quantities are changing. So we are going to get rid of the effect of the prices by calculating the real GDP. It is going to be 2,000 plus 36,000, which will give you 5,600. So now we find the real GDP is less than nominal GDP. 5,600 is less than, I think we find 6,900 for nominal GDP. Is because nominal GDP includes the price increase as well as the quantity increase. But the real GDP only considers the quantity changes because keeping the prices, it's when you calculate real GDP, you keep the prices constant. Let's do the last year's calculation. Again, the same thing. I don't need to change the price, right? Because I'm going to use the constant prices, which is the base year's prices, but the quantities need to be changed. So let's write the quantities for year 3. Year 3, the quantity is 180, and for basketball is 275. Let's calculate with using calculator. So it will come up 5,100. So here 5,100. As you see again, when you compare to nominal and real GDP, you have different results. Nominal GDP is increasing in year 2 compared to year 3 compared to year 2, but here the real GDP is actually, this country is not doesn't have growth in the output because the real GDP is decreasing from year 2 to year 3. So that's why it's important to look at the real GDP instead of nominal GDP, because the real GDP focuses on the output growth, which is the determinant of living standards for a country. And the next part is asking calculate GDP deflator. So GDP deflator is, as you know, nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. So given that we have the numbers 360 for nominal GDP and real GDP is 360, 690, 56, 7470, 500. So if you plug these numbers into here, you are going to find GDP deflator for each year. What is interesting here, for the first year, the GDP deflator should be 100. Why? Because the ratio of nominal GDP and real GDP is 1. They are the same. So you expect that every base year, GDP deflator is 100. You don't need to even calculate the GDP deflator. For year 2, it should be different because we use the constant prices for calculation of real GDP, but nominal GDP uses the current prices. So nominal GDP is higher than real GDP, and you expect a number that is greater than 100 because the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP is greater than 1. And that is true for year 3 because the nominal GDP is higher than real GDP. You will have a GDP deflator greater than 100.